Good morning. What a beautiful day it is in the state of Kansas. We'll take a day like this every day of the week. Well, good morning and welcome to the 132nd Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. Before I introduce the people up here, I would like to introduce a few guests for this Landon Lecture this morning. We're very pleased to have the 1st District Congressman, and he's doing a superb job, Congressman Jerry Moran. Jerry? And then we're very pleased to have the U.S. District Judge Gary Sebelius. There he is. As you know, he refers to himself as the first dude. The spouse of the governor of the state of Kansas. She could not make it today, but Gary is here. And of course, Gary and Pat go way, way back. Keith Sebelius was the U.S. representative in the big first. And so they're like brothers. It's just like we're all one big happy family. So we're very pleased to have you here. State Representative Kenny Wilk and the chair of the House of Representatives Economic Development Committee. Kenny, thank you. State Representative Sidney Carlin is here. Sidney? State Senator Lana Oline. Lana, please. There she is. Thank you very much, Lana. State Representative Roger Wrights. Roger, where are you? Right here. Oh, there he is. I'm also pleased to have one of my bosses here, Reggie Robinson, President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents, who's doing a great job. Reggie, there he is. Thank you very much. And then we're very pleased to have the president of KTEC, that most important economic development agency in the state, Tracy Taylor. Tracy? Thank you very much. Well, thank you one and all for coming this morning. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome our own U.S. Senator Pat Roberts to the Landon podium to join 131 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and their opinions on important public issues right here to K-State. Before introducing Senator Roberts, I would like to introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Bob Zabel, Professor of Education and the President of our wonderful K-State Faculty Senate. Bob, thank you very much. Next to her, Haley Yurkovich. Haley from Overland Park, President of the Kansas State University Student Body. And I know John O'Hara is here, a dear friend and just the outgoing president of the Kansas State University Student Body. John, stand up please so we can give you a hand. John O'Hara. On my right, also a very dear friend and the chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury, Ed Seaton. And next to him, Chuck Reagan, who's the chairman of the Landon Lecture Series and my very excellent executive assistant. Chuck? Well, I am so pleased and honored to be able to introduce a great friend of mine and a terrific Kansan for all ages, Senator Pat Roberts, to the Landon podium. Senator Roberts was an 8-term congressman from the 1st District, the one that Jerry Moran is now representing, and he's now in his 2nd term as a U.S. Senator. And by the way, you know, twice he's been voted the wittiest and funniest U.S. Senator. Well, he has built his reputation as a leader in national security and defense issues, agriculture, and health care, just to name a few. He has been a strong, strong advocate of education. That's K through 12, all of the universities that we have in the state of Kansas. He is especially and keenly helpful to the University of Kansas and K-State, and we appreciate that so much. He also is one of our great experts on what we call free and fair trade, and he's promoted science and technology. Pat Roberts came to Topeka several years ago to talk to, and Kenny, we want to thank you for helping set that all up, and Kent Glasscock, who was Speaker of the House at the time, to talk to all of the key legislators. And I think most of the legislature was there about the importance of higher education and what schools like KU and K-State can do for the economy of this state. And because of that meeting, because of the leadership of Dave Kerr and Kent Glasscock and Kenny Wilk and all the others, all of a sudden, 3 buildings are springing up: a life sciences building at KU, an aviation building at Wichita State, and a agricultural biosecurity building that's going to put Kansas State on the map in the whole world in terms of a building that's going to protect the nation's food supply. Senator Roberts is chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Intelligence and has been leading the effort to improve America's intelligence apparatus and analytical capabilities. He has chaired the recent meetings on the adequacy and quality of our intelligence prior to the Iraq War, and I know he's going to talk about that today. But long before then, like in 1999, Senator Roberts warned of the possibility of an attack on America's homeland. He said then, and he was talking about Osama bin Laden when no one else really could even pronounce the name. He said then, quote, "There is a real opportunity for a handful of zealots to wreak havoc on a scale that hitherto only armies could attain." In addition to chairing the very pivotal and key Senate Intelligence Committee, and by the way, he's on constantly on MSNBC and CNN. I think there's only one other person in the U.S. Senate, maybe John McCain, that has been on more of the talk shows in the past couple of years than Senator Pat Roberts. That's how important he is. He's also a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on emerging threats and capabilities. His subcommittee oversees the military's contribution to homeland security, as well as efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Senator Roberts is well known in Kansas, of course, for his work as chair of the House Ag Committee, where he led the reform of federal farm policy that is still with us today, and it's working pretty well. More recently, he's helped write and pass critical legislation to assist in drought relief, and several years ago, he wrote a sweeping reforms to the federal crop insurance program. Senator Roberts was born in Topeka, and I'm sure many people here remember fondly his father, Wes Roberts, who was chairman of the Republican National Committee and a very, very close friend of Dwight David Eisenhower. Following his graduation from Kansas State University, where he was a sterling straight A student, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 4 years and then worked as a reporter and editor for several Arizona newspapers. He joined the staff of Senator Frank Carlson. I know there are many people out here that remember fondly the important work of U.S. Senator Frank Carlson. Later became the administrative assistant to Congressman Keith Sebelius of the 1st District. And Gary introduced him at our breakfast this morning and did an excellent job. Well, when Representative Sebelius retired, Pat Roberts was elected to the Congress, where he served for 16 years before being elected to the Senate in 1996. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Roberts is a superb senator for all Kansans. He's a great personal friend of mine, and he's a huge friend and supporter of his alma mater, K-State. Please help me welcome Senator Pat Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning, K-State. That was pretty pathetic. Let's try that again. I'm going to say good morning, K-State. You're going to say good morning, Pat. We'll see if we can get that down. Good morning, K-State.
Good morning, Pat.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honor of speaking as a Landon lecturer. There are several reasons why I regard this opportunity as a personal privilege. First, K-State is the pride of three Roberts generations: my father, Wes, myself, and my son, David. Now, I fully realize it is most unique, if not unprecedented, for an alum like myself to join the ranks of past speakers, including cabinet members and journalists, renowned public figures, and presidents, no less. In this regard, I know two things. First, this is a very impressive and fast crowd I am riding with. I will do my best to keep up. No doubt my classmates and my contemporaries who know the unvarnished truth about my academic credentials and other undergraduate learning experiences are scratching and shaking their heads and wondering how on earth I have achieved this 30 seconds of Andy Warhol and John Weefald fame. Well, at K-State, uncommon achievement is a common experience, or wonders never cease. Second, my doctor can attest to the fact that I bleed purple regardless of the K-State endeavor. My university, right or wrong. From the bowl games and the pep rallies to working with President Weefald and his excellent staff and faculty, with a full measure of my public service capabilities, I try as hard as I can to follow the example of so many of our K-State alumni, to give back to my university and to do what I can to contribute to K-State's outstanding record of excellence. Working with K-State's leadership, we have accomplished much in regard to research investment. Thank you, Kenny Welk, and thank you, Steve Morris, and thank you, Kent, pardon me. And it is research that has and will benefit our state and the individual lives and pocketbooks and safety of our Kansas citizens. And it works both ways. K-State does an outstanding job, and we in turn are in a better position to support and win federal investment. Just let me say it in simple terms. We try to tote the bucket for K-State and not spill a drop. And folks, in terms of what K-State is doing and will do, you ain't seen nothing yet. Finally, the Landon Lecture Series was started in 1966 by K-State President James A. McCain, right here in McCain Hall. That was 8 years after I graduated. But, you know, President McCain used to have a lecture series years before. He would always open and close the lecture. It was required attendance back then, sit up straight, mandatory presence, don't you dare fall asleep. And President McCain had a habit of unbuttoning and buttoning his coat during his remarks. It can now be divulged, it's unclassified, that this habit led to a secret betting pool among Pike AA pledges on the number of times he would unbutton and rebutton. And it sort of caught on among all students. And I don't think that President McCain ever realized that those sudden bursts of applause or students simply getting up to leave had very little to do with his remarks. It was just that some were short in the betting pool and wanted him to continue, and some were long and they wanted him to stop. Now, if you are thinking about really bringing the betting pool back, don't do it today. You need time to plan and to set it up then why don't you try it when Senator Tom Daschle is your speaker next week? Ladies and gentlemen, as President Wefald indicated, the year was 1999. The place was the Emerging Threats Subcommittee within the Senate Armed Services Committee. The setting, one of the numerous hearings held with regard to terrorism and homeland security. And as chairman, I said back in 1999, some of which has been quoted by John, terrorism is not a new phenomenon. What is new, however, is the arsenal of weapons now available to terrorist groups. The modern tools of the terrorist trade may no longer be explosives or conventional battlefield weaponry or truck bombs or suicide bombers. The new death machine employed in the name of God by his self-proclaimed disciples might spring from a dirty nuclear device, chemical formulae, laboratory vials, or cyber codes. These new tools, as John has indicated, I said, create a real opportunity for a handful of zealots to wreak havoc on a scale that hitherto only armies could attain. And I continued to say back then that terrorism is a form of warfare. It is not random violence. It is now driven by visceral hatred toward this nation and all that it stands for. Terrorism seeks to instill fear, unnerve governments, undermine policies, sap public support. Targets are selected carefully and deliberately to further these aims and for their symbolic value, like the World Trade Center in the heart of Manhattan, a U.S. embassy in some world capital, or the Khobar Tower in Saudi Arabia. Terrorists select their targets and mode of attack in order to maximize the impact of the attack. And because terrorists seek to call attention to whatever misguided cause they are pursuing, they need to escalate their attacks, making each more spectacular and more horrific than its predecessor. For the terrorists, the world is their stage upon which they perform their very, very hideous acts. And then I closed my remarks in the 1999 hearing by saying, I must tell you, I worry that for all of the rhetoric, old and new, for all of the organizational reshuffles and newly requested funds, we remain woefully unprepared for what has become the nation's most urgent security challenge. So that's what I said back in 1999. Bluntly put, it was not as if the dog did not bark before September 11. Over and over again, we heard from expert witness after expert witness and commission after commission. I even made it a point to quote Osama bin Laden and warn that if the terrorist had had access to the grid of the World Trade Center back in 1993, thousands would not have come out suffering from smoke inhalation. They simply would not have come out. But you know, we couldn't get traction. Even when we authorized funds for consequent management training with the New York Port Authority and the Department of Defense. And I must say that in speaking here at home, before many interest groups and businesses and civic organizations and our regular listening tours, I would also close my remarks by repeating Osama's threat and the fact that the oceans no longer protect us. The terrorist threat was very real, including that of something called agri-terrorism. But despite this, there was very little traction, and quite frankly, very little press. One gentleman at a Rotary Club meeting came up to me afterwards and asked me, Pat, are you trying to scare us? And I said, yes, if that's what it takes. Fortunately, and not surprisingly, I did not have to do much convincing with John Wefald and his food safety team here at K-State. Kansas State University was the first land-grant school to testify before the Congress in regard to the danger that terrorism does pose to our food supply, and in addition, laid out the groundwork or blueprint for positive solutions. The results, K-State is now the leader in food safety and safety research initiatives. During these pre-9/11 years, throughout all of the testimony, I asked expert after expert, What is the one thing that keeps you up at night? Without exception, they replied, the global war on terrorism requires better intelligence. And that is what brings me here today. I have the privilege of being the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. We are continuing to spearhead the committee's inquiry into pre-war intelligence with reference to Iraq, and in a larger sense, the global war against terrorism and our homeland security. And the inquiry includes the following. First, we are examining the quantity and quality of U.S. intelligence on Iraqi's weapons of mass destruction programs, the ties to terrorist groups, Saddam Hussein's threat to stability and security in the region, and the brutal repression of his own people. Second, we're taking a hard look at the objectivity, the independence, and the accuracy of the judgments reached by the intelligence community, whether those judgments were properly disseminated to policymakers in the executive branch and the Congress, and whether any influence was brought to bear on anyone to shape their analysis to support any policy changes. Third, we are also investigating whether public statements and reports and testimony regarding Iraq by U.S. government officials were substantiated by the intelligence information. In other words, how was the intelligence used? My committee has created an intelligence matrix, if you will, by which we can compare the public statements by the Bush administration, by the Clinton administration, and yes, by members of Congress as to any differences between the intelligence and the public statements. We want to know whether there was any misuse or any manipulation. Now, I mentioned members of Congress. Just as the executive used the intelligence, the Congress made use of the same information in voting for regime change and for the war and to fund the war. And it should be pointed out, only months ago, many of today's most vocal critics in the Congress and on the campaign trail made statements in their understanding of the use of intelligence that were far more declarative and far more aggressive than the President and the members of his administration. Now, the point is that I also made those statements. We all did. I did so as an informed member of the Senate Intelligence Committee after many briefings and hearings and by studying, as the administration did, the conclusions of the National Intelligence Estimate prior to going to war. The problem is, the information was wrong. As Dr. David Kay, who led the Iraq Survey Group, put it, if you read the total body of intelligence in the last 12 to 15 years that flowed on Iraq, I quite frankly think it would be hard to come to a conclusion other than Iraq was a gathering and serious threat to the world with regard to the weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Kay also said that when we have the complete record, we will discover that after 1988, that's when the inspectors left, it became a regime that was totally corrupt. Individuals were out for their own protection, and in a world where we know others are seeking WMD at any cost, it's likely that at some point in time, a well-financed buyer would have found a willing seller, making Iraq a far more dangerous country than even we had anticipated. Finally, the committee's inquiry will also take a look at the pre-war intelligence assessments about post-war Iraq. And you know the news of the day. You know of the sacrifice of our young men and women in uniform, and you know that the situation in post-war Iraq is extremely serious and dangerous. A final report from our committee is very near completion. We have over 310 pages. We've interviewed over 200 analysts. We have our facts together and we have our conclusions, and we hope to get bipartisan member support. And our hope is to have it wrapped up by June with public hearings. And I have said from time to time that we will let the chips fall where they may. Now, I can't say too much about the report's findings in this forum because it is still a highly classified document, but I can tell you that our report does not paint a flattering picture of the performance of our intelligence community as they develop their pre-war assessments. It's important to understand that the problems experienced were also global in nature and involved the intelligence services of many countries. Almost everyone believed, regardless of how you felt about whether you should have unilateral military action or wait for the UN, there was no disagreement about the belief that the weapons of mass destruction actually existed. Before the war, there was very little difference of opinion between the US, the British, the German, the Israeli, the Russian, the UN, and French, yes, even the French, intelligence with regard to whether or not Iraq had WMD. It is my view that this was clearly an intelligence failure as opposed to alleged manipulation. When asked if they had any evidence that any of the 1,400 members of the Iraq survey team had been pressured to change their judgments, both Dr. David Kay and Charles Dulfer, the current team leader of the ISG, stated the analysts were not pressured to make certain their pre-war intelligence reports did conform to some kind of a White House agenda in reference to Iraq. These views are also consistent with the findings of our committee staff, who, as I have already indicated, have interviewed over 200 analysts all throughout the intelligence community. Now, I had hoped that the committee, with its tradition and its institutional memory, could handle this inquiry in a responsible manner untainted by politics. This has been difficult, especially given the circumstances of a presidential election year that started very early. I do not question the integrity or patriotism of any member of Congress, but I must say some of the criticism and commentary within the Congress has been very harsh and lacking any plausible, realistic, or positive alternative, and some of it has been dead wrong. And I know this: these remarks, this debate is carefully studied, used, and doubtlessly manipulated by our terrorist enemies. Now, I full well realize that politics is a rough and tumble business, but politics should never or should not be reduced to lobbing partisan hand grenades in the middle of a war. Politics is not war. Terrorism is. I remain hopeful that once we make our report public, we will then get to the business of recommending and implementing reforms and changes to the systemic challenges within our intelligence community. Our security depends upon it. The issue of intelligence reform comes down to three fundamental questions: if, when, and how. If we need to reform the intelligence community, and if so, when to execute this reform, and finally, how to go about actually implementing that reform. The answer to the first question, if, is clear. There are serious problems with both the collection and analysis of the intelligence that went into the pre-war intelligence assessments with regard to Iraq. We need to get the full story. We need to get the full story of denial and deception and the status. But it is unlikely that we are going to find stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction at this late date in Iraq, as was predicted by U.S. intelligence and global intelligence. Well, the next question is when. There will never be an ideal time to make changes. The 15 agencies, that now comprise the intelligence community are on constant alert, more so today than ever before. There is no lull. But if Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld can be in the midst of transformation of our U.S. military in a time of war, it seems clear that we should be able to make changes to our intelligence community as well. In fact, war demands and is a catalyst for long-needed transformation. We do not yet have all the answers about what went wrong before 9/11 and in the pre-war Iraq work, but I believe we know enough to begin the process of seriously discussing intelligence reform. In fact, our conclusions within the inquiry literally beg for reform. Osama bin Laden is not waiting for additional reports, and neither should we. That leaves us with the most difficult question: how? Well, first, my friends, there is some good news. Things have gotten dramatically better in the intelligence community since 9/11. 2 years ago, the joint House-Senate 9/11 investigation, on which I also served, proposed 19 recommendations. The executive branch has implemented 12 of them, including an all-source terrorism information center, wholesale FBI reform, improved counterterrorism training, and more linguists, just to name a few. Other recommendations are pending in the executive branch, including how to reduce the barriers within law enforcement and our intelligence agencies. Congress has implemented 4 changes: a National Watch List Center, a Terrorist Information Fusion Center, oversight of the Patriot Act, and a review of classification policy. More pending. That is a success story that has not been told and should be. The Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Rockefeller, and I have agreed to hold reform hearings just as soon as we can make our inquiry public. We will ask experienced intelligence hands for their best advice. Well, what might these reforms be? What will they include? First, there's a question of resources. Since 9/11, the intelligence community has had and will have a significant increase in funding, making up for that bathtub funding that we experienced back in the 1990s. The question is now less a matter of do they have enough, as opposed to are they spending it wisely? We continue to spend money on increasing collection when we still don't have the ability to fully analyze what we already collect. Second, while a case is being made for the need for more resources, we must do a better job of oversight on the way the Intelligence Committee and community does its work. Director George Tenet of the CIA has said he will need 5 years to rebuild his clandestine service. There are those who disagree and argue the CIA must be serious about changing the way it does business. Simply requesting more money and people is not enough. Do we need to create a new human intelligence agency to do what the CIA can't or won't do? Obviously, settling issues of this type will take strong and continued oversight and expertise. Another option, the creation of a domestic intelligence agency similar to Britain's MI5, has been discussed by splitting off the FBI's counterintelligence and counterterrorism operation. Now, let me note for those of you who were not here that our FBI director, Robert Mueller, our last Landon Lecture speaker, does oppose this. He's moving mountains to remake the FBI from a law enforcement agency to a counterterrorism agency. And I think we should wait and see what the director accomplishes on this front. In Congress, we must look carefully at the way we actually conduct the oversight of the intelligence community. Should we continue to divide the jurisdiction over the intelligence community between the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee? DOD controls 80% of the funds. There's also a very big issue of term limits for members on the Intelligence Committee. Now, when the committee was formed in the 1970s, term limits were imposed to prevent members from being co-opted by the intelligence community. This has had the unintended consequences of forcing members off the committee just as they are becoming knowledgeable enough to serve as effective overseers. Now, perhaps the most discussed change that has been discussed is the proposal to create a director of national intelligence. There are many in the Congress who say there is a conflict of interest inherent in a single individual serving both as director of the CIA and as director of the entire intelligence community. There is broad agreement that from an organizational standpoint, we need to manage the entire community rather than serve the interests of one particular agency. The issue that troubles most members of Congress is that of accountability. Almost 3 years after 9/11, no one in the intelligence community has been disciplined, let alone fired. Almost 2 years since the publication of the October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate that declared Saddam Hussein had the weapons of mass destruction and was reconstituting his nuclear program, no one has been disciplined, let alone fired. Are we asking too much? Is this an unfair standard? The intelligence community cannot be all-knowing, all-seeing. It cannot be omniscient. The Congress certainly is not. Finally, some of the criticism is somewhat disingenuous in that before 9/11, analysts routinely were required to avoid risk, to be as certain as possible, to be sure. If there were 10 dots to connect to provide an accurate analytical product, the standard operating procedure, other than an emergency, was to connect at least 7 or 8. After 9/11, understandably, there was a dramatic upheaval within the intelligence world. The key incident, I believe, was the attack on the USS Cole. The first indication, clearly, there could be storm clouds in one theater and lightning could strike in another. Now, the admonition is, do not be risk averse. If you can connect 3 or 4 dots, move the product, issue the threat warning. So today, those who work within the intelligence community are being blamed for being risk averse prior to 9/11, and just the opposite in reaching a consensus with regard to Iraq. And in fact, the intelligence community seldom gets credit for what they detect or deter or prevent. Finally, we are doing some things right. There have been no further attacks on our homeland since 9/11. God willing, there will not be, but the threat is always there. It remains. I think we should expect and demand the community simply be candid with the President and the Congress about what it does know and what it does not know. A golden rule should be instilled into all analysts and managers. Tell me what you know, tell me what you don't know, tell me what you think, and make sure I understand the difference. Rarely is any intelligence case a slam dunk. We have found serious failures to share information before 9/11 and in the pre-war work on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Where is the accountability? One explanation may be a common and innate Washington problem, an institutional inability to recognize or admit there are problems. Simply put, the intelligence community is in denial over the full extent of the shortcomings of its work on Iraq and 9/11. We need fresh thinking within the community. We need fresh thinking within the Congress to enable the intelligence community to change and adapt to the dangerous world in which we live, and for all of us to look in the mirror and honestly examine our collective performance over the last decade. In my years on the Senate Intelligence Committee, I have traveled around the world, and I have met many of the brave and hardworking men and women of the intelligence community who risk their lives every day, in order to keep us safe. Their dedication is without bounds. We must ensure they are not held back by a flawed system that does not allow them to do their best work or does not allow us to get the most value and security out of that work. We need to honor their hard work and sacrifice by giving them and the American people an intelligence community worthy of their efforts. So as we try to implement the specific intelligence reform, and in a larger sense, as we continue the fight against global terror, let us try to be a little more realistic in our goals. Certainly, it would be preferable to have definitive and precise intelligence. Although given the nature of the asymmetrical terrorist warfare, we simply cannot wait. We must act with the best intelligence available. The same is true with regard to the international community. Everyone would prefer to have more help in Iraq, the Germans, the French, and the Russians, helping to reconstruct and to provide security. That goal makes a very appealing campaign speech, but the question is really moot And the argument is unrealistic, if not cynical. France and Germany and Russia made it absolutely clear that they would never support the overthrow of Saddam, and with proper UN inspection, we may be close to finding out why. As for the UN, the international legal case against Saddam, as spelled out in 17 resolutions, was unprecedented. But the debate in the UN went on and on, giving Saddam repeated one last chances to comply with Resolution 1441 or face military force. Unfortunately for world stability, Saddam did not comply. In the past, we have failed to act waiting on definitive, if not foolproof, intelligence, which we know is not realistic with this type of enemy. The same is true with regard to total UN and foreign consensus. These failures to act actually encourage the terrorist. Whatever lapses may have occurred in the 8 months of his presidency before 9/11, President Bush had the courage to act. In doing so, he turned 20 years of anti-terror policy on its head. He went on the offense. He took the war to the terrorists. He toppled state sponsors of terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now is attempting to achieve stability in the Mideast. You can agree or not, and I know there are many differences of opinion, but I submit to you that this is leadership. Prior to 9/11, the idea that any president would have toppled the Taliban, I think, was wishful thinking. The media was full of hand-wringing about the dangers. The establishment warned the U.S. would get bogged down in a hopeless war of attrition. President Bush took the risk, and the people of Afghanistan and Pakistan are safer as a result. And with 70 to 80% of the Taliban and the al-Qaeda leadership killed or captured, so are we. This is what we ought to be debating this election year and beyond. What matters is what strategy against terrorism the U.S. should pursue now and for the next 4 years. Presidents take an oath to protect the American people. Today, they must do so based on information that will always be imperfect. Today, a president does not have the luxury of waiting on the French, the Germans, the Russians, or the UN, or proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The president acted to protect America and prevent another 9/11. The next president, regardless of who he is, will have to do the same thing. In this regard, I believe a policy of what the columnist Charles Krauthammer calls realistic preemption remains the logical choice in the war against terrorism. In a world of terrorists and terrorist states and weapons of mass destruction, the option of preemption is especially necessary. Deterrence did work in the bipolar Cold War period, but deterrence does not work against people who ache for their version of a better afterlife. It does not work against those you cannot deter, and it does not work against those we cannot detect, enemy regimes that may attack through clandestine means, a suitcase nuke, or an anonymously delivered anthrax attack. In the past, we used the threat of retaliation after we had been attacked. And in today's world, that is too late. The point of preemption is to deter the very acquisition of the WMDs in the first place. And with the exposure of A.Q. Khan, the international WMD godfather, and the dismantling of his network, with the decision of Libya to dismantle its WMD program, with the North Koreans at least taking part in diplomatic disarmament efforts led by China, with Pakistan an ally and partner in the search for Osama, with Iran opening up their WMD door just a crack for the international inspectors, the resolve we have shown with regard to Iraq, hopefully, is paying some dividends. However, with all of this talk about preemption, I do have a word of caution and I think a warning. Whether or not the United States views itself as an empire, it is obvious that for many foreigners and international critics, we look, walk, and talk like one, and they have responded accordingly. An empire that displays weakness and is not taken seriously is in very serious trouble. However, being perceived as capricious or imperious is also dangerous. The problem has often occurred when an imperial power insists on imposing a particular vision on the world. It seems to me that in fighting the global war against terrorism, we need to restrain what are growing U.S. messianic instincts, a sort of global social engineering where the United States feels it is both entitled and obligated to promote democracy, by force if necessary. Again, the United States must be willing to use force unilaterally if necessary to protect our security and that of our allies. But it is also time for some hard-headed assessments of American interests. I do not believe America wants to be or is an empire. We may be perceived that way, and it may serve our critics to say so. But unlike Rome, unlike Britain, unlike France, unlike Spain, not to mention Germany and Russia, we do not hunger for territory. It is absurd to apply the word empire to a people whose first instinct upon arriving on anyone's soil is to demand an exit strategy. We are, in fact, unique in history, a nation of immigrants that by destiny or pure accident has been designated the custodian of the international system and the guarantor of freedom, stability, and representative government. So as we work our way through the crisis in Iraq and approach the June 30 deadline for yet-to-be-defined sovereignty and governance, let us remember the tender roots of freedom. The right of all peoples must be planted carefully in stony soil. Liberty cannot be laid down like so much astroturf. Law and order must come first. Without stability, there can be no representative government, only anarchy. Now we are facing a daunting challenge. The United States and the Bush administration have taken on a huge challenge, which will not be resolved for several years to come and directly impacts the global war against terrorism. When we succeed, and there is no other option, we may transform the world for the better, and I believe America for the better as well. If we do not, Islamic extremism will hold hostage Muslim nations throughout the world, threatening individual liberty, if not civilization. Samuel P. Huntington was prescient in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. Today, it comes down to a choice between confrontation to preserve world order and civilization as we know it, or capitulation. I think the choice is clear. Former Secretary of State George Shultz has stated he likens our situation in history to World War II and 1937. In the 1930s, and to some degree in the 1990s, we failed to do what we needed to do to head off a world conflict. Appeasement and inaction never works. Ladies and gentlemen, the stakes are huge, and the terrorists know that as well as we do. I submit to you, it is a matter of resolve. Thank you again for the privilege.
You want to take a few questions? Sure. Thank you, Senator Roberts, for an outstanding Landon lecture. We do have a few minutes for questions, so the microphones are on your left or on your right. And so please step down to the mic and the senator will answer any questions you might have. think we have one over here.
Yes. Originally had questions about raising the term limits on sitting on the Committee for Intelligence. But just to further clarify something that you said in your speech, I mean, are you willing to say that? I mean, are you directly criticizing the president for saying that he believes that he's been appointed by God to use the United States as a vehicle to spread liberty and freedom throughout the world?
I just think we have to have a very pragmatic approach to our foreign policy. I think that Samuel Huntington said in his book, again, and I would urge you to read it, it goes back to 1997, 1998. It was absolutely prescient in regards to what was happening in the Arab world. And he said Western civilizations should try or think about not trying to impose their values in areas of the world where they are not wanted or appreciated, and try to plant the seeds of what we're about where they are appreciated, and to nurture them and to certainly better our own civilization. And that was way before 9/11. And I just agree with that, and I think you can have a hard-headed assessment in terms of our national security interest. I believe in preemption because of the problems that the WMD and these various weapons that are being used by terrorists today. Don't forget in Washington that had it not been for the Let's Roll heroes of Flight 93, I probably wouldn't be standing here. Let's not forget the ricin scare. Let's not forget the anthrax scare. These are very dangerous times. And so I'm not trying to minimize that, and I'm not trying to criticize the president in regards to taking a risk in terms of protecting our people. It's just that I think we need a very pragmatic approach to this, and I think we are doing so with a little bit too much of a messianic fervor.
Oh, and just one last quick thing.
If you want to know about term limits, I can talk about that if you want to.
Okay, yeah, just, well, there's a long line. I have a lot of questions on that. But just one quick thing. If they do raise the term limits, because your term is up next year, would you step down and let Senator DeWine take over as chairman?
Well, I'm a great fan of Senator DeWine. He will be in an election year next year. We've had a lot of talks about it. I don't know whether it would be retroactive. I don't know whether it would be prospective, and I don't know if we're going to eliminate the term limits. But, let me give you my perspective. The first 2 years I was on the committee, I would go up every morning, and I would read the senior executive intelligence brief, which is a pretty thick document. It's very, very technical, and it's classified. And I would spend a lot of time on it, 45 minutes to an hour. And I would have a staff member, and I would say, now, what does this mean? What does this acronym mean? Under what agency does this come under? Who has the jurisdiction of this? What is their true mission? Do they have enough money? And there were a lot of questions that were asked in that vein in the first 2 and even 4 years. And there's a sense of awe, not of intimidation so much, just of awe in terms of our capabilities and what they do in the 15 agencies that comprise our intelligence community. I often tell the story. I would read the intelligence brief, wouldn't understand it, and then when it came out in the New York Times 2 days later, I said, "Oh, is that what it's about?" But having said, and there are too many leaks in Washington without any question, but you do get more comfortable, and you do study very hard, and you have to be very conscientious. And we have members on the committee that are very conscientious, and then we have those on the committee who do pay attention to other things. And so I would hope, just at the time that you gain enough experience, that would not be the time that you would be term limited off of the committee. There's arguments both ways. In the 1970s, during the Church days and the Bill Casey days, they thought that you would be co-opted by the intelligence community, that the longer you serve. I think it works the other way around. I think you're co-opted and overawed the first 2 to 4 years. Took me quite a while just to sit there and think, I don't know what they're talking about, so I'm going to raise my hand and say, what on earth are you talking about? And then if there was a question I did not understand, or they were talking about some geopolitical strategic mission, I would always say, I wonder what the Dodge City Coffee Klatch would think about that. And if you ask that question, you're right on the money. I went to all of the 15 agencies when I became chairman. I thought there were 13. I found out there were 15. And I said, I'll be your champion. I will be your champion. What is your mission? What do you really do? What do you need? What are your priorities? But if something ends up on the fan, we're going to have to fix it. And to fix it, you got to have experience. So I would favor the elimination of the term limits, whether or not I serve as the chairman next time, or if the Republicans still maintain a majority, whether it's Mike DeWine or whether it's Senator Rockefeller. I think we have a good group, but we have a good group on the Intelligence Committee that does not have that much experience.
There's a question over here on the right.
Senator Roberts, would you please share with us how we are solving the problem that Congress created of not permitting the FBI and the CIA to talk to each other? To what extent are we whipping that problem?
We had far too many stovepipes, more especially among the Defense Intelligence Agency, State Department with the INR, that's their acronym, and the CIA and the FBI, who are the two classic examples. There were just different cultures. The FBI was into crime enforcement, CIA obviously in regards to counterterrorism. Since 9/11, many of those stovepipes have come down. The warfighters in Iraq, the men and women in uniform have better real-time intelligence than we've ever had before. Not enough, but they are better. We have a terrorist threat information center within the CIA where all of the agencies are represented, and they meet every day. And they go over all of the collection that we have collected, and we try to analyze it, and there's an incredible amount of information, So with the TTIC, that's the acronym for the Terrorist Threat Information Center, you think the acronyms are tough with Barry Flinchbaugh and agriculture. I tell you what, try intelligence. It really is something else. So I think we're doing better, but it's an ongoing effort. It was always on a need-to-know basis, and if you're getting into law enforcement, you're sharing that information, it would jeopardize the investigation. That's taken down now, and so we have a much better communication system. And I think everybody understands in the war on terrorism that it is a joint effort.
We have time for a couple more questions over here. Paulette?
Senator Roberts, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to have this dialogue. I wanted to bring to your attention, which I'm sure you've seen, that about 57% of Americans still believe that Saddam Hussein is responsible for 9/11. And as you know, no intelligence agency in the world supports this view. However, President Bush, even as late as last week in his press conference, encouraged this misunderstanding. My first question is, I'm sure this disturbs you, and if it does, what is Congress doing about this, that is to remove this misunderstanding? And the second is there any discussion going on about longstanding U.S. policy in the Middle East, which could be the reason for the hatred that we find ourselves faced with in the Arab world and the Muslim world? I mean here, there's Israel's policy of occupation in Palestine.
So 20 minutes later, I will try to... let's take the last one first, then you remind me of the first one. If you read the papers today, you see where Sharon lost the vote in his own party to give up territory in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. That is a most disturbing event or circumstance. It means that he's going to have a very, very difficult time to follow what he hopes is the first step to some kind of peaceful settlement, albeit that is very, very difficult. And it means that he'll have to go to the Parliament. I don't know if he can do that. It means a crisis in his own party. He could strike some kind of a arrangement with the opposing party. I don't know what's going to happen, but it means that in dealing with Israel, you're dealing with someone whose leadership has been challenged by his own party, so it doesn't give you much consistency or much traction to really get something done. And the trouble with the Palestinian situation is we can't find anybody to deal with except Hezbollah and also Hamas. The whole arrangement, even dating back to the Oslo Accords, and the peace plan was the cessation of the hostilities and the terrorist attacks. That's not happened. But obviously in the Arab world, the U.S. is portrayed as being a very strong ally of Israel, and we are, and that under those circumstances that has really been a challenge to us to try to be as even-handed as we possibly can as we go through the peace process. I don't have a good answer for you in regards to the peace process. I wish I did. I can remember talking to somebody in Israel who was a guide, and I made the comment that I hoped that President Clinton's last efforts in regards to a settlement would be successful. The guide turned to me and he said, "You're standing on sand that contains the blood of people who have fought this battle for 2,000 years. What makes you think that you Americans can settle it in about 2 weeks?" What was your first? In terms of President Bush. We have a terrorism section in our report. I cannot specifically report on it. It does get into the links of terrorism between Iraq and terrorists, Al-Qaeda, Osama, others, especially Abu Zarqawi, who is leading the effort now in Fallujah, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as those become public, I think the picture will be much clearer.
But there was no connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein.
Maybe. School's still out.
Here's a question here.
What do you think President Bush is going to do next on the war on terrorism?
What's he going to do next? I think he's going to follow the advice of his military commanders. We hope that, working with the UN ambassador, that we can achieve some kind of sovereign entity that can lead us to a peaceful solution and representative government. That's a very tough hill to climb, as has been indicated by all the violence that we have seen, and the dedicated opposition by the Fedayeen, by the Ba'ath Party, loyalists, by the Republican Guard or the remnants of the Republican Guard, and also foreign jihadists who under Zarqawi are posing a very, very difficult problem. In the rest of the country, although there are other hot spots, when I talk to the soldiers and the Marines and others who come back, there are a lot of questions in their minds, but they are very proud of the work that they have done in regards to highway construction, in regards to better water, better utility, building schools, and helping people. I don't think all of that story has been told. Obviously, the trouble spots, get the headlines, and I understand that. But I think he's going to persevere because I think he looks at the downside risk of what happens if we would not, and what would happen if we simply left Iraq, and what would happen to the Muslim nations throughout the world, what would happen in regard to increased terrorist attacks, even over and above what we're experiencing today. And as I say, it's very, very difficult. This isn't new, and I apologize for going on like this, but the British tried this in 1921, and they put in a prince called King Faisal. I would urge all of you to go buy the tape of Lawrence of Arabia. I helped write a Marine Corps manual based on the guerrilla tactics of T.S. Lawrence, i.e. Lawrence of Arabia. King Faisal lasted for 10 years, and then they killed him. And then they had a series of genocides, and then came Saddam, and we all know what happened under him. King Faisal described the country not as a nation, but as a collection of tribes and clans, and then went on with a description that I will not repeat because it is very, very harsh. But the Brits have tried this before. Winston Churchill said, "We are not occupiers, we are liberators." And 6 months later, he said, "The people of Iraq are like an ungrateful volcano." So this has been tried before, but the stakes are so much higher now because of the access and having that be a grand central station in regards to weapons of mass destruction. The President has indicated that I must cease and desist, and I... Wait, here's the person, one last.
Senator Roberts,
Yes.
I'll be concise and ask for a concise answer. You provided a logical argument for the preemptive use of force. Can you provide a moral one?
Yeah. 3,000 people dead. Basically, I will never forget the day that I was traveling up 295, which is one of the arteries that doesn't work well in Washington. I was a little late. I was doing a honeydew project and turned on the radio and heard that the World Trade Center had been hit by airplanes being used as missiles. I cannot tell you the sinking feeling that I felt in my stomach and my heart, and that I had been talking about this, as has been indicated, for 4 or 5 years. I had just topped the hill to turn right, and I knew in my heart that the Capitol was next. I have staff there. I have young people there. And I tried on my cell phone to get through to my administrative assistant to say, for God's sake, get the staff out, because I know what's coming. About that time, my cell phone rang, and it was my son, who was at his home. And he said, Dad, where are you? And I said, I'm on 295. He said, turn around and go back home. And I said, I've heard the news, David. They've attacked the World Trade Center at the Capitol, maybe next. He said, Dad, they've hit the Pentagon. And I turned left and saw the flames and the smoke. And then I decided that I would travel on the apron of the highway because it got a little clogged at that particular time. You know how these people do. It's like when you travel from Topeka to K-State on a ball game. And people go down the apron about 70 miles an hour, and they usually signal to you that you're number one. And I careened around the curve, and I got to where I wanted to go, and then the traffic was blocked, and I went on the backside of the Capitol. Now you can't do that because there is a great large construction hole, like our state capitol, with a new visitor center put in there for security. And at about the same time I went past the Capitol on the plaza is about the same time that the plane 93 would have struck the Capitol, and I would not be here. I got to the office. Thank goodness my administrative assistant had turned everybody loose. I said, where am I supposed to go? He said, I don't know. He said, I think you're supposed to go over to the Capitol Hill Police Station, which I did. And we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know whether the Capitol was next, or the White House was next, or the whole city of Washington was next, or we're at war at next. And basically, in terms of preemption, if we can stop that, it seems to me that you have a very powerful moral argument to do that. Okay, this last question. I'm sorry.
Okay, you talked a lot about preemption and that. I'm wondering who decided that we were the ones to go in, and who decided that like North Korea as a country can't have nuclear weapons and can't build the nuclear weapons program, but we can. I mean, that just has been.
Well, we have a nuclear program, but we have never, hungered for territory, and it was always in terms of retaliation after an attack. I try to make that very clear in my speech. I've been to North Korea. I've been to Pyongyang. That is a surreal theocracy. People walk like robots. They have the largest standing army in Asia. They have artillery and, well, I won't get into the number of nuclear weapons. It isn't so much that they'd use the nuclear weapons with the number they have, but in terms of selling them in regards to the proliferation of WMD. Kim Jong-il is not President Clinton. Kim Jong-il is not President Bush. Kim Jong-il has his people basically in a situation where, again, they're almost like robots.
So who decides that that's wrong and we're right?
Because if they strike us and kill us, it's wrong, and we have no intent to strike and kill anybody in regards to preemption.
But we did Hiroshima and... Well, we're the only ones who ever used them.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We're the only ones who ever used them. And so, who are we to say that it's wrong?
Well, we are a very free and united people to a certain extent, and as I said, we have never hungered for territory. Go back to World War II, go back to World War I, go back to Korea, go back to other hostilities where we have served. And again, I don't think we have been the aggressor. We have been, there are many people in Europe today that did not come back, that lie in service, paid the ultimate sacrifice in Tunisia. I've been to these battlefields. And they gave the full measure of their sacrifice, and so that representative government could work, or we wouldn't all be speaking German, or for that matter, Japanese. I think your allegory in terms of a modern example is certainly interesting in terms of a debate, but I just don't think it's an accurate allegory. I stood on a hill at Hilla in Iraq, overlooking a mass gravesite about the size of the K-State athletic field. 18,000 bodies were buried there. Uday, who was Saddam's son, would truck the Shias in, truck by truck, men, women, children. He would rape the women, he would torture the men, and he wouldn't even bother with the kids, he just buried them alive. They are being unearthed one by one. They are being exhumed. And the wailing of the people off to the side as they came to find any shred of evidence as to whether or not their family was alive was something to behold. I stood there and I thought about man's inhumanity against man. 500,000 people, maybe 1 million. It's another Rwanda. It's another Cambodia. It's another Holocaust. And I thought, my God, how can people be capable of doing things like this? So I think basically your argument is moot, and I think I've made my case. Thank you.
Okay, good job, man. Good job.